My husband transferred all our property to his mother and said, "Leave with what you came with." I silently signed every paper. He celebrated for a month. But he had no idea that 7 years ago I secretly changed the documents. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me when exactly I knew. When did I realize that the man sleeping next to me for 14 years had been quietly, methodically building a trap? The honest answer is, I didn't know. Not all at once. It came in pieces. Small, forgettable pieces that I kept setting aside the way you set aside junk mail. You tell yourself it's nothing. You tell yourself you're paranoid. And then one Tuesday morning in March, you sit across from a notary public and sign your name to papers that hand over everything you built, everything you sacrificed, everything you are. And you realize the junk mail was the eviction notice all along. My name is Diane Caldwell. I was born in Savannah, Georgia, raised by a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry, and a father who believed that a woman's name on a deed was the most powerful thing in the world. Paper doesn't lie, he used to say. People do. I married Richard Caldwell when I was 26, believing I had found the exception, a man who was steady, careful, and honest. We bought a house in a quiet suburb north of Atlanta. I worked as a paralegal at a mid-sized firm downtown. Richard managed logistics for a regional freight company. We were not rich, but we were solid. We had a 3-bedroom house with a cracked driveway I kept meaning to fix, a joint savings account, a small rental property on Birchwood Lane that we'd scrimped to purchase in our 8th year of marriage. We had a life, or so I believed. The first signal came so quietly I almost missed it entirely. It was a Sunday, about 3 years before everything collapsed. Richard's mother, Gloria, had driven up from Macon for the weekend. Gloria Caldwell was a particular kind of woman, the kind who smiled at you warmly while mentally cataloging every crack in your ceiling. She had never approved of me. I was too independent, she said once, meaning it as an insult. I thanked her for it, meaning it as a compliment. That weekend, I overheard her and Richard talking in the kitchen while I was coming down the stairs. I caught only a fragment. "She doesn't need to know the details, Richard. Just handle it quietly." When I walked in, they stopped. Richard smiled and said they were discussing his mother's property taxes. I poured my coffee and let it go. I should not have let it go. Over the following months, I noticed Richard taking phone calls in the garage. Not arguments. He was always calm, almost rehearsed. He began asking me, casually, almost absently, which accounts my paycheck went into. He asked whether my name was on the firm's pension plan. He asked once whether I had a separate savings account of my own. I told him no. That was the truth. And I watched something in his face relax when I said it, a tension I hadn't even noticed until it left him. Then came the paperwork. It started with the rental property. Richard told me our accountant had suggested restructuring the ownership for tax purposes. He slid a document across the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening. It was dense, full of the kind of language designed to make your eyes glaze over. I was tired. I had spent the day reviewing depositions. I asked him to summarize it. He said it was standard, just shifting the Birchwood property into a holding structure, temporarily, to reduce our liability exposure. He said our accountant, Dave, had explained it all. He said Dave could call me if I had questions. I said I'd read it later. I didn't read it. I signed it. That was the first time. Over the next several months, there were more documents, always presented at the end of a long day. always accompanied by a reasonable explanation, always involving Dave, whom I had met exactly twice at a holiday party and whose last name I realized I didn't actually know. The house, the savings account structure, the small investment account Richard had opened in what he said was both our names. Each time, he offered to explain. Each time, I trusted him instead. And then came the morning of March 14th. I remember the light in the notary's office, yellow, institutional, the kind that makes everyone look slightly ill. Gloria was there, which surprised me. She sat in the corner in her good beige coat, hands folded in her lap, watching. The notary, a thin man with reading glasses on a chain, slid a folder across to me. Richard sat beside me, relaxed, one hand resting on the table near mine but not touching it. "Just the final restructuring," he said. "We talked about this, remember?" I didn't remember, but I looked at his face, calm, familiar, the face I had made breakfast for 14 years, and I reached for the pen. I signed every page. I did not read them closely. I should have. Because what I signed, as I would discover 4 days later when I pulled my copies and took them to a colleague at work, was a complete transfer of every jointly held asset, the house, the Birchwood rental, the investment account, into the sole name of Gloria Ann Caldwell, his mother. That evening, Richard made pasta for dinner. He opened a bottle of wine. He was in a wonderful mood. After dinner, he leaned back in his chair, looked at me across our kitchen table, our kitchen table in the home I had helped pay for over 14 years, and said with a smile I will never forget, "You should start thinking about what you want to take with you. You came here with nothing, Diane. You can leave the same way." I looked at him. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I picked up my wine glass, took one slow sip, and said, "Okay." He thought that was the end of it. He had no idea it was the beginning. That night, after Richard fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time. I did not panic. I want to be clear about that because people assume that a woman in my position, blindsided, stripped of everything she'd built, told to leave with nothing, would fall apart. Maybe some do. I had been a paralegal for 11 years. I had sat across from women in exactly this kind of room, exactly this kind of situation, and I had watched what happened to the ones who panicked. They made mistakes. They said things they couldn't take back. They tipped their hand before they had cards worth playing. So I sat in the dark, and I took inventory. The house, a 3-bedroom colonial on Sycamore Drive, purchased in 2011 for $267,000. By current market estimates, worth somewhere between $410,000 and $430,000. Now, on paper, in Gloria's name, the Birchwood rental, a 2-bedroom bungalow we'd bought in 2019 for $148,000, currently rented to a young couple for $2,400 a month. Also now in Gloria's name, the joint savings account, $34,200, which had been quietly migrated into an account I was no longer listed on. The investment account, approximately $61,000, restructured months ago into something I apparently had no claim to. My own checking account, $3,800. My car, a 2018 Honda Civic, was in my name alone. That was something. My work pension, which I had never once discussed with Richard in any meaningful detail, I wasn't sure. I would need to check. That was the full picture. 14 years of work, of sacrifice, of choosing the practical thing over the personal thing again and again. And in exchange, I had $800, a used Honda, and a husband who had just told me to leave. Was I afraid? Yes. I won't pretend otherwise. Fear is not weakness. It's information. And the information my fear was giving me that night was precise. I was in danger. Not physical danger, but the kind of danger that destroys a life just as thoroughly. Financial ruin, displacement, the particular humiliation of being erased from your own existence. But underneath the fear, something else was happening, something quieter and much more durable. I was thinking. The next morning, I behaved perfectly. I made coffee. I asked Richard if he wanted eggs. I drove to work as I always did, parked in the same spot in the garage on Peachtree, and took the elevator to the 4th floor. But before I sat down at my desk, I walked to the office of the one person at the firm I trusted completely, Margaret Ossie, a family law attorney who had been practicing for 22 years and who had, on 3 separate occasions, told me I was wasted as a paralegal. I closed her door. I sat down, and I told her everything. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How long ago did you sign the last document?" 4 days, I said. She nodded slowly. "And you have copies?" "I picked them up yesterday morning." She held out her hand. I gave her the folder I had carried in from my bag. She read for several minutes, flipping pages with the focused efficiency of someone who had seen every variation of this particular story. When she looked up, her expression was controlled, but her eyes were sharp. "Diane," she said, "did Richard know that you worked here? That you have colleagues who are attorneys?" "He knows I'm a paralegal," I said. "He never asked much beyond that." She almost smiled. That was his first mistake. She explained what she was seeing. The transfers appeared legal on their face, executed with proper notarization, apparently consensual. Challenging them directly would require proving fraud, undue influence, or that I had signed under duress. Difficult, expensive, not guaranteed. The standard route was going to be slow and painful, but Margaret was not interested in the standard route. "Tell me something," she said, setting the folder down. 7 years ago, when you bought the Birchwood property, walk me through exactly how that was structured at closing." And that was when I remembered. 7 years ago, when we closed on Birchwood Lane, Richard had been out of town. A scheduling conflict with a client in Birmingham. He'd apologized, said he trusted me to handle it, asked me to call him after. I had handled it, and in handling it, I had made a small decision, a quiet decision, one I had made almost instinctively, the way you do something without fully knowing why, and only understand years later that some part of you already knew. I had made sure the deed was structured in a specific way. I looked at Margaret. I said, "I think you need to see a different set of documents." Her eyes sharpened. "You have them?" "I know where they are." That evening, I drove home, cooked dinner, and listened to Richard talk about his day. I laughed at the right moments. I passed the bread, and after he fell asleep, I went to the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, the one he had never bothered to open because he assumed it was full of my work papers, which it was. And I found what I was looking for, the original closing documents from Birchwood Lane, the deed. The ownership structure I had quietly arranged 7 years ago on a warm Thursday afternoon in a closing attorney's office while my husband was in Birmingham. The plan was already there. I hadn't built it consciously, but I had built it, and now I was going to use it. The documents I pulled from that filing cabinet were not dramatic in appearance. They were standard legal paperwork, cream-colored pages, dense columns of text, a notary seal in the lower corner. But what they contained was, I understood now, the single most important decision I had made in 14 years of marriage. When I had closed on the Birchwood Lane property alone 7 years ago, I had done something Richard didn't know about. Not because I was planning against him, but because my father's voice had been in my head that afternoon. Paper doesn't lie. People do. Without discussing it with Richard, without mentioning it afterward, I had asked the closing attorney to structure the deed with a specific provision. While both names appeared on the ownership, the property could not be transferred, sold, or refinanced without the physical signature of both parties on a new deed, a clause sometimes used in estate planning to protect against unilateral decisions. It was not unusual. It was not illegal. It was simply something I had done quietly and then filed away, and then, with the ordinary busyness of life, half forgotten. Richard had never read the original Birchwood closing documents. I knew this because he had never read any document I hadn't handed directly to him and summarized. That was his habit. That was his flaw, which meant that when his carefully arranged restructuring had transferred Birchwood Lane to Gloria's name, it had done so fraudulently. Because my signature on a new deed, a real signature, with full knowledge of what was being signed, had never been obtained. What he had gotten from me at the notary's office in March was a signature on a document that described the transfer in language vague enough that I hadn't caught it, but the underlying deed clause made that transfer invalid. It had not legally conveyed. Birchwood Lane was still, in the eyes of the law, subject to my ownership interest. I took the folder to Margaret the following morning. She read the deed provision twice. Then she set the pages down with the particular stillness of an attorney who has just confirmed something significant. "This is real," she said. "I know. This gives us standing to challenge the Birchwood transfer on the grounds that proper conveyance was never executed. The signature he obtained doesn't satisfy the deed restriction." She paused. "How long did you know about this?" "I didn't," I said. "Not consciously, I just remembered it." She looked at me for a long moment. "All right. Here's what I want to do. I want to file a lis pendens on Birchwood Lane. That puts any potential buyer or lender on notice that there's a legal dispute attached to the property. It doesn't transfer anything. It just freezes it, prevents Gloria from selling or refinancing while we build our case. Can Richard block it? He can contest it, but contesting it requires him to argue that the deed provision doesn't apply, which means he has to admit he knows about the provision, which means he has to explain how the transfer happened without satisfying it. She allowed herself a small, precise smile. He's going to have a bad day. The lis pendens was filed on a Thursday afternoon. I drove back to the office, answered emails, processed 3 sets of documents for an ongoing estate dispute, and drove home. Richard was on the phone when I came in. His mother, from the sound of it. He waved at me absently. I went to the kitchen and started dinner. I was at the stove when the shift happened. It was subtle. I almost didn't see it. He came into the kitchen and stood in the doorway, phone lowered, watching me. The look on his face was not anger. It was calculation. The look of someone who had just received unexpected information and was trying to assess it. "Everything okay?" I asked, without turning around. "Fine," he said. "Just a lot on my mind." He didn't mention Birchwood. He didn't mention any paperwork. But that evening, I heard him in the garage again, speaking in that low, flat voice he used when he didn't want to be overheard. And the following morning, when I came downstairs, he was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a yellow legal pad in front of him, covered in handwriting. He closed it when he heard me on the stairs. That was how I knew they had noticed. But the real evidence, the proof of intent I had not yet had, the thing that would shift my case from a property dispute to a clear demonstration of coordinated fraud, came not from a document, but from a phone call. It happened because of a mistake, not mine. Richard's cousin, Jeff, was a man I had never particularly liked or disliked. He existed at the edges of family gatherings, cheerful and unremarkable. But Jeff worked in commercial real estate, and 3 weeks after the LI's pendants was filed, he called my cell phone by accident. He was trying to reach Richard. He spoke for almost 15 seconds before he realized he had the wrong number. In those 15 seconds, I heard him say, "Rick, your mom's attorney called. Said the title company flagged the Birchwood filing, wants to know how to handle the wife's challenge. Did you want to go ahead with the Birmingham strategy or hold off until she signs the divorce papers?" He caught himself. There was silence. "Jeff," I said, "this is Diane." The call ended immediately. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 4 minutes. Then I opened my phone and sent a text to Margaret. "Call me when you can. I just got what we needed. The Birmingham strategy. Divorce papers already drafted. A title company already involved in managing the transfer. This was not a spontaneous decision by a man who had grown tired of his marriage. This had been planned. It had been planned carefully, with multiple parties, over an extended period of time. And now I had heard it in Richard's own family's words." I drove back into the office. I sent Margaret a voice memo with every detail I could remember, recorded while it was still fresh. That recording, combined with the deed clause and the list pendants, was the foundation of everything that came next. I had passed the point of no return. The plan, as Margaret and I had structured it by that point, had 3 components. First, the list pendants on Birchwood Lane, already filed, which froze the property and attached a visible legal dispute to its record. Second, a formal complaint to the State Bar of Georgia regarding the notary who had processed the March transfer documents. Because once we examined the notarization more carefully, we found a procedural irregularity. The notary had acknowledged my signature without confirming my identity against a valid ID, a violation of Georgia notary statutes. Third, and most significant, a civil fraud claim against Richard and Gloria Caldwell for the coordinated transfer of marital assets through misrepresentation, using Jeff's inadvertent phone call and the recorded voice memo as the backbone of our documentation of intent. I also, quietly and without drama, opened a new personal checking account at a bank Richard had no association with. I moved my paycheck. I updated my direct deposit with HR on a Tuesday morning, using my employee portal login from a computer at work, and said nothing about it at home. I was still cooking dinner every night. I was still asking about his day. He didn't know. For a while. The call came on a Saturday morning in early May. I was in the backyard with a cup of coffee when Richard appeared in the doorway, phone in hand, face the color of old paper. He walked toward me slowly, and I could see him deciding in real time how to manage what he was about to say. "I got a call from a title attorney," he said, "about Birchwood." "Oh," I said, "there's some kind of filing on the property, a notice." He paused. "Did you do that?" I looked at him steadily. "Why would I do something like that, Richard?" He stared at me. And in that moment, I watched something shift in his face, the first visible crack in the confidence he had been living inside since March. He had not considered, not truly, that I might have moved, that the woman he had told to leave with nothing might have, instead, been very quietly learning to fight. He went inside. He called his mother. An hour later, Gloria's car turned into our driveway. She came in without knocking. She had always treated this house as an extension of herself, which I had tolerated for 14 years and would not be tolerating much longer. She sat at the kitchen table across from me, handbag on the table like a shield, and looked at me with the specific contempt she had been polishing for more than a decade. "Diane," she said, "I think we need to have an honest conversation." "I agree completely," I said. "You signed those papers," she said. "Whatever your attorney is doing, those signatures are valid. You're wasting everyone's time, including your own. You have nothing here. The smart thing, the dignified thing, is to accept a settlement, take what you're offered, and start over." "What am I being offered?" I asked. She and Richard exchanged a look. Richard said, "We're prepared to give you the Civic outright and a cash payment of $15,000. $15,000 for 14 years, for a house worth $400,000 and a rental property generating income every month." I took a sip of my coffee. "I'll think about it," I said. Gloria's eyes narrowed. "Don't think too long. Once this goes to court, anything you might have had disappears in legal fees." "That's a kind warning," I said. "Thank you." She left that visit dissatisfied, which I could tell from the way she walked to her car. Fast, shoulders up, no goodbye. Richard stayed, and after she left, he sat down across from me and tried a different approach. His voice dropped to something almost gentle. "Diane, I know this isn't how you imagine things ending, but it wasn't working. You know it wasn't." He reached across the table as if to touch my hand. I moved mine to wrap around my coffee cup. He continued, "I don't want this to get ugly. I don't want you to lose everything fighting something that's already decided. Please, take the offer." I said I'd think about it, I said. 3 days later, it escalated. I came home from work on a Wednesday evening to find that the locks on the house had been changed. My key didn't work. My personal belongings, clothes, my father's watch, 2 boxes of files, had been stacked neatly on the front porch. There was a handwritten note from Richard. "The property belongs to Gloria Caldwell. You are not a resident. Please collect your things." I stood on that porch for a moment. Then I took out my phone and called Margaret. "Change the locks," I said. "When?" "Today." "Good," she said, which surprised me. That's unlawful exclusion from the marital residence, regardless of what the deed currently says, because you are still a legal spouse. I'm going to file an emergency motion for residential access and add this to the harassment documentation. Can you stay somewhere tonight? I stayed with my colleague Andrea, who lived 20 minutes away and who did not ask many questions, for which I was grateful. The court granted the emergency motion within 48 hours. I returned to the house with a sheriff's deputy and a locksmith, which was not a comfortable experience, but it was effective. The following week, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize, containing a single photograph, a screenshot of a private social media post I had made 6 years ago, something personal and unflattering and thoroughly out of context. The message beneath it said, "Drop the filing or this goes to your employer, your colleagues, and the local bar newsletter." Blackmail. Crude and desperate. I forwarded it to Margaret, who forwarded it to a cybercrime specialist at a firm she occasionally collaborated with. The origin of the email was traced to an account registered to a Gmail address that, with minimal investigation, turned out to be linked to a secondary account of Jeff's, Richard's cousin, the man who had accidentally called me weeks earlier. I documented everything. I filed it. I added it to the case. And then, because I had been operating at full tension for 6 weeks and I was a human being and not a machine, I called Andrea, told her I needed 48 hours, drove to a small inn I knew in the North Georgia mountains, and did not check my email for 2 days. I walked. I ate breakfast slowly. I slept 8 hours both nights, which I had not done since March. When I came back, I was ready. When I returned from the mountains, the house was quiet. Richard had moved into the guest bedroom sometime during the previous 2 weeks. I wasn't sure exactly when, because I had stopped paying close attention to his schedule. We lived during that period like two strangers who happened to occupy the same building. Polite at the margins, careful about timing, careful about eye contact. He made coffee in the morning. I made coffee in the morning. We used different mugs without discussing it. The legal proceedings had created a kind of enforced cohabitation that neither of us had anticipated. Because I had been legally restored to the marital residence and because Richard had not yet filed formal divorce paperwork, Margaret suspected he was waiting to see how the property dispute resolved before triggering the divorce process, since a divorce filing would force a formal accounting of marital assets. We were, technically, still living as husband and wife in the same house. It was one of the stranger periods of my life. But the attempts did not stop. They simply changed in character. About a week after I returned from the mountains, Richard knocked on the door of what had been our bedroom and asked if he could come in. I was reading. I said yes. He sat in the chair near the window, not on the bed, not close, and he looked at me with an expression I had not seen from him in years, something softer. Something that, if I had not known what I knew, I might have read as genuine. "I've been thinking," he said, "that we handled this wrong. Both of us." I set my book down. "I'm not saying everything I did was fair," he continued. "I'm saying it got out of hand. And I think there's a version of this where we resolve it between ourselves, without attorneys, without courts. Something equitable." He paused. "I spoke to my mother. She's willing to consider a revised arrangement. If you were to withdraw the filings, we could negotiate directly." I looked at him for a moment. Outside, a car passed on Sycamore Drive. Somewhere a dog was barking. "Richard," I said, "how long did you plan this?" He blinked. "What?" "The restructuring, the documents, Gloria, Jeff, the title company. How long?" He said nothing. "I'm asking," I said, "because what you're describing, a direct negotiation, no attorneys, would benefit exactly one person in this room, and it isn't me." I picked up my book. "I'll let Margaret know you reached out." He left. He did not knock on my door again. Did the temptation touch me at all? Honestly, yes. Not because I wanted to reconcile. That ship had not only sailed, but sunk. But because there was a version of me that was exhausted, that wanted it to be over, that wondered, in the quietest part of the night, whether fighting was worth the cost, the time, the money Margaret was carefully billing at a reduced rate because she was, I understood, also angry on my behalf. The endless management of stress and strategy and performance. There were nights I lay in the dark and thought, what if I just took the $15,000 and left? And then I thought about my father, about his hands, about the way he talked about paper and people, about the fact that I had stood in a closing attorney's office 7 years ago and made a quiet decision that had protected me without my even knowing it. That past version of me had trusted me to do something with it. I was not going to let her down. The social support, when it came, arrived in a form I hadn't expected. I had mentioned almost nothing of this to anyone outside Margaret and Andrea. I am, by nature, private. Not cold, but careful. I had not called my mother in Savannah with the details, not wanting her to worry. I had not confided in coworkers beyond what was professionally necessary, but about 10 days after I returned from the mountains, I received a text from a woman named Carol Simmons, who had been in my book club years ago, before the group drifted apart. Carol had heard, through the particular osmosis of suburban social life, a neighbor, a school connection, some chain of whispers I couldn't reconstruct, that I was going through something. She texted to say she was thinking of me. She didn't ask for details. She said, "If you want to walk on Saturday, I'm always up for the trail near Henderson Park." I went. Carol was a high school vice principal, practical and unhysterical, the kind of person who had dealt with enough manufactured drama in her professional life to recognize the real kind. We walked 3 miles and I told her concisely what had happened. She listened, asked 2 clarifying questions, and then said something that stayed with me. "He thought you were alone," she said. "People only do this to someone they've convinced themselves has no one." She was right. That had been Richard's foundational assumption, that I was isolated, dependent, without professional knowledge or independent network. He had seen a woman who worked quietly and kept to herself, and he had read that as vulnerability. He hadn't understood that some people are quiet because they're listening. Carol introduced me the following week to her sister-in-law, Patrice, who was a licensed therapist. I started seeing Patrice once a week, not because I was falling apart, but because I understood that what I was managing required more than strategy. It required someone helping me track my own interior, keeping me from making decisions from fear or from the dangerous overcorrection of anger. Patrice was steady and direct. She said in our second session, "You've been managing everyone else's reactions for months. Are you allowing yourself to have your own?" I thought about that for a long time. Meanwhile, Richard and Gloria watched. I could feel it, the monitoring, the wait-and-see quality of the weeks that followed. They were calculating whether I would run out of resources, emotional or financial. They were betting on attrition. They had misread the situation entirely. On a Sunday morning in June, Gloria Caldwell came to the house uninvited. This was not, on its surface, unusual. She had been doing it for years. But the timing was deliberate. Richard had told me the night before that he was going to visit a friend in Buckhead and would be back in the evening. I suspected later that he had told her exactly when he would be gone and when I would be alone in the house. I was in the kitchen when her car pulled into the driveway. I watched through the window as she came up the front walk. Slower than her usual pace, I noticed. Softer. She was wearing a lavender blouse I'd never seen, and she was carrying a white bakery box. It was a performance I could read from 20 feet away, but I opened the door anyway. Understanding what people are doing is not the same as refusing to let them do it. Sometimes you learn more by watching. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said with a warmth she had not previously bothered to extend in my direction. "I was at the bakery and I thought of you." "Come in," I said. She set the box on the kitchen table, almond croissants from a place in Roswell, and sat down without being invited, which was, I supposed, consistent. I made coffee. We sat across from each other. She smiled. I waited. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she said, folding her hands, "about everything that's happened. And I want to be honest with you, Diane. I've been hard on you over the years. I see that now." "I appreciate that," I said. She continued, the confession of a woman who had decided that softness was the most efficient tool available. She had been protective of her son, she said. She had perhaps interfered where she shouldn't have. She could see that some of what had happened was unfair. She wanted to make it right. She wanted, she said, looking at me across the table with eyes full of manufactured sincerity, for us to talk, woman to woman, mother to daughter-in-law, and find a way through this that didn't destroy everyone. It was, I have to admit, well executed. If I had not known what I knew, if I had not heard Jeff's voice on the phone that day, if I had not spent weeks with Margaret reviewing every document and every decision, I might have felt the edge of it. The suggestion of dignity restored, the invitation back into the fold, but I knew. So I listened. I nodded at the appropriate moments. I refilled her coffee, and I let her talk until she had laid out the full shape of what she had actually come to say, which arrived as these things always do, after the warmth ran out. "The problem," she said, her voice shifting almost imperceptibly, "is that what you're doing? These filings, this legal campaign, it's going to cost you more than you'll ever recover. Attorney's fees, years of your life. And for what?" She paused. "I spoke to someone familiar with these matters. What you have on that Birchwood property is a technicality. Courts don't like to unwind properly notarized documents over technicalities. You'd spend 2 years fighting and end up with less than we're offering you now." There it was. The mask, thin now, functional. "The offer is still $20,000, she said. "We've increased it. $20,000 and the Honda free and clear. You start over. You're still young. You have your career." She tilted her head. "Is this really worth your next 5 years, Diane?" I looked at her over my coffee cup. Gloria Caldwell, who had sat in a notary's office in a beige coat and watched me sign away my home, who had, I now knew from documented communications Margaret had obtained through Discovery, initiated the asset restructuring plan 18 months before it was executed, who had referred to me in a text message to Richard as the paralegal problem and advised him to handle it before she figures out she has options. "Gloria," I said, "I'm not going to withdraw the filings." The warmth left her face like a light switch. "You're being a fool," she said, not loudly, quietly, which was worse. "Maybe," I said. "You have no idea what kind of resources we can bring to this." She stood, picking up her handbag. "You have 1 attorney. We have 3. You have a notary complaint and a deed clause. We have documentation that you were a fully informed participant in every transfer. We have witnesses. We have a very compelling picture of a woman who agreed to restructure marital assets voluntarily and is now claiming confusion to avoid a divorce settlement." She left the croissants on the table. She walked to the front door, and she stopped with her hand on the frame and turned back. "Think about your reputation," she said. "Think about your job. Think about what people will say when this becomes public, when the story isn't wronged wife but confused paralegal who didn't read her own documents." A pause. "We can make that the story, Diane. Easily." The door closed. I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of that Sunday morning. The croissants were still warm. The coffee was getting cold. Was I afraid? Yes. She had landed something real, a narrative attack, not on the legal facts, but on perception, on professional reputation, on the ambient social story that people form about a woman who is fighting. She was threatening to make me look incompetent in the one arena I had devoted my professional life to. That was not nothing. But here is what I had come to understand about fear over the previous months. It is most useful when you let it sharpen you rather than scatter you. The fear I felt in that kitchen did not make me want to retreat. It made me want to be more precise. It made me want to be more ready. I called Margaret that afternoon. "She came to the house," I said. "I assumed she would." Margaret's voice was steady. "How do you feel?" "Ready," I said. "Good," she said, "because I got the financial disclosure documents back from Discovery this morning. Diane, I need you to come in tomorrow. There's something you need to see." I went to Margaret's office the following morning at 8 o'clock. She had a conference table spread with documents by the time I arrived. Printed pages, color-coded with tabs, a yellow legal pad covered in her handwriting. She poured coffee without asking and gestured for me to sit. Across the table, I noticed, was a third chair occupied by a man I hadn't met. 50s trim, rimless glasses, the economical stillness of someone who spent his professional life reading numbers. "This is Alan Bryce," Margaret said, "forensic accountant. He's been reviewing the financial disclosures Richard's attorneys submitted last week." Alan nodded at me. He did not waste time. "The disclosures are incomplete," he said, significantly. "There is a holding entity incorporated in Delaware 18 months ago, Caldwell Property Group LLC, to which at least 3 asset transfers were directed prior to the ones you signed in March. Those transfers are not mentioned in the disclosure. There is also a secondary savings instrument at a credit union in Macon, tied to Mrs. Gloria Caldwell's address, that received periodic deposits from the joint marital account over a period of approximately 2 years." He paused. "These deposits total $41,200. I looked at him. He was moving money to his mother for 2 years. "Incrementally," Alan said. "Small enough amounts to avoid automatic flagging, consistent enough to constitute a pattern." Margaret set a page in front of me. "This is what we're taking into court this week. The lis pendens gave us the standing. The deed clause gave us the fraud angle on Birchwood. Jeff's phone call gave us intent. And now this," she tapped the page, "gives us the full picture of premeditated asset dissipation." Asset dissipation, the legal term for deliberately depleting marital assets before a divorce, specifically to deprive the other spouse of their equitable share. In Georgia, it is taken seriously by family court judges. "How soon?" I said. "The hearing is Thursday," she said. I spent the following 3 days working, sleeping, seeing Patrice, and not thinking about Thursday any more than I had to. Margaret had told me more than once that clients who spend too much time rehearsing worst-case scenarios before a hearing make poor witnesses and poorer decisions. I trusted her judgment. I focused on what I could control. On Thursday morning, I wore my navy blazer. I had owned it for 6 years. It was the jacket I wore when I sat beside attorneys in depositions, when I carried case files into courtrooms, when I was the person in the room who was expected to be composed and correct. It felt right. The courtroom was smaller than people imagine. Family court usually is. No gallery, no audience, a judge, clerks, attorneys, and the parties. Richard and Gloria sat at the opposing table with their 3 attorneys. Richard was in a charcoal suit. Gloria was in gray. They both looked, when I came in, at my face. I imagine they were checking for something. Nerves, uncertainty, the residue of that Sunday morning conversation. I gave them nothing. Margaret presented the case with the economy of someone who did not need flourishes, because the facts were sufficient. The Birchwood deed clause, the transfer documents obtained without satisfying it, the notary procedural violation, Jeff's phone call, documented in the voice memo. The Delaware LLC opened 18 months before the transfers. The $41,200 in deposits to Gloria's credit union account. The email with a photograph, traceable to Jeff's secondary account. It was a detailed, specific, documented account of a coordinated plan to fraudulently transfer marital assets. Richard's lead attorney, a man named Warren Polk, who had the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to winning on procedure, attempted 3 times to redirect. He argued the deed clause was a standard restriction with no bearing on a subsequent consensual restructuring. Margaret had a Georgia appellate case from 2019 that said otherwise. He argued the LLC was a legitimate business entity used for estate planning. Alan had the transfer record showing marital funds flowing into it before any business activity occurred. He argued the deposits to Gloria's account were gifts, not dissipation. Margaret had the timing. Every deposit followed a significant marital expense, suggesting deliberate offsetting. Polk paused, adjusted his notes, tried a different angle. And that was when Gloria made her mistake. She leaned forward and said something to Polk in a low voice. He shook his head slightly. She said it again, louder, loud enough in the quiet of that small courtroom for the clerk and the judge to look up. I heard the word paralegal and the word coached and the word arrangement. The judge looked at her directly. "Ma'am," he said, "I'll need you to communicate through your counsel." Gloria sat back, but the damage was done. Polk was rattled. You could see it in the way he straightened his papers with the excessive care of someone recalibrating. Richard's jaw had tightened. He was looking at his mother with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, but something close to disbelief. She had, in her frustration, broken composure in front of a judge at the moment when they most needed to appear coordinated and calm. And in doing so, she had confirmed the thing Margaret had been building toward, that Gloria was not a passive beneficiary of a property transfer, but an active participant. The judge reviewed Alan's financial analysis for 8 minutes in silence. He asked 3 questions, each of which Alan answered precisely. He looked at the deed clause. He reviewed the notary complaint, which had already resulted in a preliminary finding of procedural violation from the state bar. Then he looked at both tables. "I am inclined," he said, "to grant an interim injunction, freezing all assets currently held in the name of Caldwell Property Group, LLC, and Gloria Ann Caldwell, that have been identified as originating from the Caldwell marital estate, pending full resolution of the fraud claims. I am also referring the notarization issue to the bar for formal review. We will set a full evidentiary hearing for September." He looked at Richard's attorneys. "Counsel, I'd strongly encourage your clients to reconsider their position before September." Warren Polk said carefully that they would take the recommendation under advisement. I looked straight ahead. Margaret touched my arm once, briefly, under the table. They settled in August, 6 weeks before the September hearing. I had expected a fight until the end, but the interim injunction had done what interim injunctions are designed to do. It froze their ability to maneuver. The Delaware LLC had no accessible funds. Birchwood Lane could not be sold or refinanced. The Sycamore Drive house was effectively untouchable. People like Richard and Gloria, people who operate through maneuvering, are most defeated when they have no room to move. Warren Polk contacted Margaret in the first week of August. He used the word resolution 4 times in his opening paragraph, which Margaret told me was the diplomatic equivalent of waving a white flag. The negotiation took 10 days. What we arrived at was this: the Sycamore Drive house was to be sold. From the proceeds, just over $420,000, I received 60%, Richard 40%, reflecting the court's preliminary finding of dissipation. The Birchwood Lane rental property was transferred fully into my name. The deed clause had made the original transfer legally defective, and the fraud documentation made it untenable for them to argue otherwise. The $41,200 transferred to Gloria's Macon account was repaid to the marital estate and included in the distribution. My share of the investment and savings accounts was restored in full, with an additional $7,500 toward my documented legal costs. Gloria retained nothing that had come from our marriage. The notary faced a formal censure from the state bar. Jeff's involvement was documented in the settlement record, which was not sealed. The final documents were signed in separate rooms at Margaret's firm on a Thursday in mid-August. I was told Richard left the building quickly, without speaking to his attorneys at length. What I did see was Margaret's face when she came into the conference room where I was waiting. She sat down and slid the execution copy across the table. "It's done," she said. I looked at the document. All those months, reduced at the end to a stack of paper that said I had not come here with nothing, and I was not leaving with nothing. My father had been right. Paper doesn't lie. I signed my name one final time. Later that afternoon, I drove to Birchwood Lane and parked in front. I sat in the car looking at the small house, the trimmed hedge, the brown mat at the door, the window boxes. It was mine. It had always been mine. I had made sure of that 7 years ago in a closing attorney's office, with no particular plan, only my father's voice in my head and a habit of paying attention. I was not happy in the way people perform happiness after a victory. I was something more durable than that. I was clear. The apartment was on the 3rd floor on Ponce de Leon, 2 blocks from a park I walk through most mornings. High ceilings, good light, and my father's desk in the study. On the first morning I woke up there, I felt the precise absence of dread. I passed the Georgia bar exam 6 months after the settlement. Margaret offered me an associate position. I accepted. Family law, primarily. Territory I understood from the inside. I kept Birchwood. I had the cracked driveway repaired in October. Richard ended up with less than a straightforward divorce would have given him. Gloria had to liquidate her savings to return the 41 down $200, sold her Macon property, and moved into a smaller rental. Her relationship with Richard cooled considerably. Plans built on assumed easy victory tend to damage the planners when they fail. Jeff lost his position at his firm and relocated. The following June, I sat in a restaurant garden with Carol, Andrea, and Louise. We talked about books. We did not mention Richard or Gloria once, not because it wasn't part of the story, but because it was the past, and I had learned the difference between acknowledging the past and living inside it. Paper doesn't lie. That is the story of how I signed my name and was told to leave with nothing, and didn't. I didn't plan to be clever. I only paid attention, made one quiet decision 7 years before I needed it, and refused to panic when someone tried to erase me. What I learned: the most powerful thing you can build is a foundation that holds even when you've forgotten you built it. Know what you signed. Know what you own. Never assume the person across the table knows more about your life than you do. If you were sitting where I sat, what would you do? Leave a comment, and thank you for listening.